Once, Cuba commanded one of the strongest armies in Latin America. Soviet jets in its skies, Soviet frigates in its waters, 200,000 soldiers under arms. Today, the planes can't fly, the ships can't sail, the lights won't even stay on. And 90 miles away, the most powerful military on Earth is asking a question: is now the time? Ever since Washington intensified its pressure campaign against Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, Cuba has increasingly found itself in America's crosshairs. The US has tightened sanctions, escalated its rhetoric, indicted senior Cuban figures, and deployed an aircraft carrier to the Caribbean, a blunt reminder of American military dominance. The question now is Cuba prepared for this growing pressure? Does the island have the military capability to deter or withstand potential US aggression? During the Cold War, Cuba had one of the strongest militaries in Latin America. With support from the Soviet Union, the country had more than 200,000 soldiers, sent troops to conflicts in places like Angola and Syria, and used advanced Soviet fighter jets and warships. Now that force is down to some 40,000 to 45,000 active duty soldiers divided into 3 parts to defend the country's east, west, and center. Its air force was once considered to be among the best in Latin America, with modern Soviet MiG jet fighters. Its navy had boasted 3 Soviet-built frigates. Frank Mora, who was President Barack Obama's top defense official for Latin America, revealed that today, the Air Force's handful of warplanes likely aren't airworthy, and Cuba's naval vessels don't work beyond the small boats operated by its Coast Guard.
Cuba had a first-world military in a third-world country. Now it has no chance against the US military. It's a shell of what it used to be.
The Trump administration disagrees. In January, the American president signed an order declaring Cuba an unusual and extraordinary threat to American national security, saying the country's government aligns itself with US-designated terrorist groups, transnational criminal organizations, and rivals to Washington such as Russia and China. A new report might back the claim, or maybe not, because Trump's rhetoric is stronger than his approval rating. According to Axios, Cuba has acquired more than 300 military drones from Russia and Iran, and had discussed plans to use them to attack the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay, US military vessels, and Key West. Havana, however, has outright rejected the allegation, saying Washington is fabricating a case to justify potential military intervention. On May 21st, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban American who has long criticized the Havana government, also accused Cuba of hosting intelligence bases for China and Russia. Rubio's accusation came after the US indicted Raúl Castro, the country's 94-year-old former president and an icon of the Cuban Revolution. The charges relate to a 1996 incident in which the Cuban military allegedly shot down 2 unarmed civilian planes operated by Brothers to the Rescue. Experts say the drone news and the indictment of Castro are part of a narrative being constructed by the US government to justify an invasion or other military action against Cuba if negotiations fail.
The US leaked that to make Cuba seem like an imminent threat. The Cuban military would never launch a preemptive strike against the US. It would be suicidal.
Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel has warned that military action against the island would provoke a bloodbath of incalculable consequences. Earlier, he had vowed to fight and die in defense of the country if the US attacked. To fend off invading troops, presumably from the US, Cuba depends on a defense doctrine known as War of All the People. The doctrine dates back to the post-Vietnam War era and was instituted by Fidel Castro in 1980. Since relations with the US have deteriorated, the Cuban government has stepped up what it calls National Days of Defense to practice repelling invaders. The Cuban military would be hampered in any fight by the US blockade of oil shipments to the island, which produces only about 40% of its crude oil needs every day. Cuba has been undergoing daily nationwide blackouts that sometimes last for days. Its streets are empty amid a lack of fuel for even the most essential transport. Morale and motivation are also factors. Cuba's military has been living through a years-long economic crisis that has exhausted the population. And those troops have been unable to train or maintain their weapons, said Craig Deer, who served early in Trump's first administration as Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council.
Maybe their rifles work and maybe they have bullets, but when you're going against the best in the world, you don't have a chance.
Evan Ellis, professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College, said that there is no indication that Cuba has any offensive capability, but it could fight a war for survival in the event of a U.S. invasion. Meanwhile, Russia has declared that it would provide active support to Cuba despite attempts by the United States to intimidate and tighten the sanctions noose around the communist-run island republic.
The White House's efforts to tighten sanctions on Cuba, along with the long-standing trade, economic, financial, humanitarian, and more recently, fuel and energy blockade, reflect Washington's intolerance of any dissent, a cynical embodiment of the revived Monroe Doctrine. We are confident that the Cuban people, who have shown resilience and courage for decades, will remain united in defending their freedom, independence, and national interests. We strongly condemn any foreign interference, intimidation, sanctions, or threats against Cuba, and reaffirm our full solidarity and support for the Cuban people during this difficult time.
As tensions between Washington and Havana continue to rise, Cuba finds itself facing one of its most challenging geopolitical moments in decades. While the island's military power is no longer what it was during the Cold War, Havana appears determined to rely on a combination of national unity, civil defense strategies, and support from allies like Russia to resist external pressure.